He denied his mate to save his kingdom. Now the Alpha King will burn the world to win her back. The scream tore through the great hall before anyone could stop it. Elara felt her knees buckle as the bond snapped inside her chest like a rope pulled too tight. She pressed both hands against her stomach, gasping, while hundreds of eyes in the coronation hall turned to stare at her. She was only a servant girl. She was not supposed to matter. She was not supposed to be standing in the middle of the grand hall when the new Alpha King rose from his throne, took one breath of the air around her, and locked eyes with her, as if the whole world had gone silent. Alpha King Draven Ashworth had felt it the moment she walked through the doors carrying a tray of wine for the noble guests. It hit him like a lightning bolt splitting an old oak tree in half. His wolf rose inside him, howling with a joy so fierce it frightened him. "Mate!" The word echoed through his mind, through his blood, through every nerve in his body. He had waited 28 years for this feeling, and now that it had finally arrived, it could not have come at a worse moment. The hall was filled with lords, ladies, warriors, and diplomats from every allied pack in the northern territories. Banners hung from the stone rafters, candles burned in tall iron stands, and seated in the front row, wearing a gown stitched with silver thread, was Seraphine, daughter of Alpha Godric of the Ashen Valley Pack. Her marriage to Draven had already been arranged. The treaty papers were already signed. The alliance between their two kingdoms was the only thing standing between peace and a war that had already claimed too many lives on the eastern border. Draven stood frozen at the top of the stone steps, his crown still warm from where it had just been placed on his head, and looked down at the girl holding the wine tray. Her hands were shaking now. She could feel it too. He watched her chest rise and fall too quickly, watched her lips part as she tried to breathe through the shock of finding her fated mate, standing above her in a room full of people who would never accept a servant girl as their queen. Elara did not know his name yet. She only knew that something inside her had just changed forever, and that the man looking at her with wide, stunned eyes was the reason. The whispering started almost immediately. Nobles leaned toward each other, hiding their mouths behind gloved hands. Godric's face had gone pale, then red, then a dangerous shade of purple. He rose halfway from his seat, his hand already moving toward the hilt of the ceremonial blade at his side, though everyone knew this was not the place for blood. Seraphine's expression did not change at all. She simply watched, cold and still, waiting to see what the new king would do. Draven's chest heaved. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to walk down those steps, take Elara's hand, and claim her in front of everyone. That was what a true alpha was supposed to do. That was what his father would have done, had he lived long enough to find his own mate. But Draven's father had not lived. He had died defending the borders from the very pack that now sat in the front row, waiting for a wedding that would finally end the fighting. If Draven turned away from Seraphine now, in front of her father, in front of every ally who had gathered to witness this alliance, the treaty would collapse within the hour. War would return to the borders by morning. Villages that had only just begun to rebuild would burn again. Children would lose their parents the way he had lost his. He looked at Elara. She looked back at him, and for one heartbeat, he saw something in her eyes that he would remember for the rest of his life. Hope. Raw, trembling hope that he would choose her, that fate would win over politics, that the ancient bond between true mates was stronger than any treaty written by men. He was about to destroy that hope with his own voice. "I am sorry," he said, so quietly at first that only she could hear it over the pounding of her own heart. Then he straightened his shoulders, turned to face the crowd, and spoke the words that would haunt him for years to come. "This girl is not my mate. There has been some confusion. I ask that she be escorted from the hall so that we may continue the ceremony." The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Elara felt the rejection mark begin to burn along the base of her neck, a sensation like fire crawling under her skin, branding her with the truth that her own fated mate had just denied her in front of the entire kingdom. The wine tray slipped from her fingers and shattered against the stone floor, the sound echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Guards moved toward her, not unkindly, but firmly, their hands closing around her arms to guide her away. She did not fight them. She could not find the strength. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. As they pulled her toward the side doors, she looked back one last time, at the man on the dais, the man whose crown still gleamed under the candlelight, the man who had just told an entire kingdom that she meant nothing to him. Draven did not look away. He forced himself to hold her gaze, because he owed her that much, even as his wolf clawed at the inside of his chest, screaming at him to stop this, to run after her, to fix what he had just broken. He clenched his jaw until it ached, and watched the doors close behind her. Godric settled back into his seat, satisfied, though his eyes remained narrowed with suspicion. Seraphine finally allowed herself a small, controlled smile, though it did not reach her eyes. The ceremony resumed as if nothing had happened, as if a young woman's entire world had not just been shattered in front of hundreds of witnesses. But something had happened. Everyone in that hall had felt the pull between the new king and the servant girl, even those who did not understand what a mate bond truly was. They had seen the way his hands trembled at his sides. They had seen the way his voice cracked on the word mate. And though no one dared speak of it openly, whispers would follow Draven Ashworth for the rest of his reign. Outside the hall, in a narrow stone corridor lit by torches, Elara pressed her back against the cold wall, and finally allowed herself to fall apart. The guards who had escorted her out did not linger. They had their own orders, their own fear of the new king's temper, and neither of them wanted to be near the girl who had just humiliated herself in front of the entire court, even though everyone knew the humiliation had not been hers to carry. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the stone floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her whole body shaking. The rejection mark burned hotter now, spreading from the base of her neck down toward her collarbone, a permanent reminder of what had just happened. She pressed her palm against it as if she could smother the pain, but nothing helped. This was not a wound that healed with pressure or time. This was a wound carved into the bond itself. She had grown up hearing stories about mates. Her grandmother used to tell her, late at night by candlelight, that finding a true mate was the greatest gift a wolf could receive, a bond stronger than any promise, any oath, any crown. Elara had believed those stories the way children believe in miracles, without question, without doubt. She had never imagined that the greatest gift could also become the greatest curse. A servant girl named Wren found her there an hour later, curled against the wall, her eyes red and swollen. Wren had worked in the palace kitchens for 3 years, and had seen many things within these stone walls, but she had never seen anything like this. She knelt beside Elara without a word, and simply placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the only comfort she could. "You should not stay here," Wren whispered eventually. "If the king's men see you still on the grounds after what happened, there is no telling what they might do to keep the peace with Alpha Godric's people. You need to leave before nightfall." Elara nodded slowly, though the words barely registered. Leave. The idea felt impossible and necessary all at once. She had nowhere to go, no family left in the capital, nothing but the small bundle of belongings she kept in the servants' quarters. But staying meant facing him again. Staying meant living in the shadow of a man who had looked her in the eyes and called her nothing. That night, under a sky heavy with clouds, Elara packed the few things she owned into a worn leather satchel. She took one last look at the palace towers rising against the darkness, their windows glowing with candlelight from a celebration that was still, somehow, continuing without her. She thought about the wine tray she had dropped, the sound of it shattering, the way the crowd had stared at her like she was something to be pitied and dismissed at the same time. She thought about him, about the way his eyes had widened the moment their gazes met, the way his breath had caught, the way for one single heartbeat she had believed, truly believed, that he would choose her over everything else. She hated herself a little for still remembering that heartbeat with something close to longing, even now, even after what he had done. She swore to herself, standing at the edge of the palace grounds with the wind pulling at her cloak, that she would never let herself hope like that again. She would build a life far from crowns and thrones and the cruel games of nobility. She would become someone new, someone the Alpha King had never met, someone whose heart could not be broken twice by the same man. Inside the palace, long after the guests had gone to their chambers and the candles had burned low, Draven stood alone on the balcony outside his new quarters, staring out at the dark shape of the forest beyond the palace walls. His wolf had not stopped growling since the moment Elara had been led from the hall. It clawed at the inside of his ribs with every breath, demanding that he go after her, demanding that he undo what could not easily be undone. He gripped the stone railing until his knuckles turned white. He told himself, again and again, that he had done the right thing. The alliance with Godric's pack was the only thing keeping the eastern border from erupting into full war. Thousands of lives depended on that treaty holding, on Seraphine becoming his queen, on the kingdom his father had died protecting, remaining whole and at peace. A crown was not a gift. It was a debt, paid one impossible choice at a time. But debts did not soothe the ache spreading through his chest. Debts did not explain away the sound Ilara's tray had made when it shattered against the stone floor, or the way her voice had broken when she gasped his rejection like a physical blow. He told himself he would forget her face in time. He told himself the ache would fade, that duty always won in the end, that kings before him had made harder choices and lived with them. He did not yet know how wrong he was. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Ilara walked alone down a moonlit road, her satchel slung over one shoulder, her chin lifted despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. She did not look back at the towers behind her. She could not afford to. Behind her lay a king, a crown, and a bond that had been broken before it ever had the chance to breathe. Ahead of her lay nothing but uncertainty, and for the first time in her life, uncertainty felt safer than staying. The road stretched on into the darkness, and Ilara walked it alone, carrying nothing but her satchel and the burning mark at her throat, unaware that hundreds of miles away, in a palace bedchamber, lit by dying candlelight, the man who had rejected her would spend the next 5 years unable to forget the sound her voice had made when it broke. Neither of them could have known, on that cold and silent night, just how far the consequences of one hurried decision would eventually reach, or how much both of their worlds would burn before this story found its ending. 3 days after Ilara vanished from the palace grounds, Draven summoned every tracker in his service and ordered them to search the surrounding villages. He told himself it was only to make certain she was safe, nothing more, that a king had a responsibility toward every subject in his kingdom, regardless of what had happened between them. His advisors did not believe that excuse for a single moment, but none of them dared challenge him directly. The trackers found nothing. Ilara had wiped her scent trail with river water and crushed herbs, a trick her grandmother had taught her years before, for reasons that had nothing to do with escaping a heartbroken king. By the time Draven's men reached the edge of the forest, the trail had gone cold, swallowed by rain and distance, and the girl's own desperate need to disappear. Draven called off the search after 2 weeks, though not because he wanted to. Godric had grown suspicious of the sudden absence of trackers from the border patrols, and Draven could not afford to raise more questions about his loyalty to the treaty than he already had. He buried his wolf's protests beneath a mountain of council meetings, border negotiations, and wedding preparations that felt more like funeral arrangements with every passing day. The wedding took place on a gray morning, beneath a sky that refused to clear. Draven stood at the altar in his ceremonial armor, the weight of his crown heavier than it had ever felt, and watched Seraphine walk toward him in a gown of pale silver. She was beautiful, composed, and utterly unreadable, exactly as she had always been. He took her hand when the priestess instructed him to, and he spoke his vows in a steady voice that betrayed nothing of the storm raging beneath his ribs. Somewhere far from the palace, in a small border town where no one asked questions about a young woman's past, Ilara stood in the doorway of a bakery and watched smoke rise from a chimney down the street. She did not know, on that particular morning, that the man who had rejected her was exchanging vows with another woman beneath a gray sky. She only knew that she had found a place to sleep, a bit of coin from sweeping floors, and a strange, hollow kind of peace that came from being completely unknown. She told herself that peace was enough. She told herself that a life without a crown, without a court, without a man who could shatter her with a single sentence, was a life worth building. She did not yet know how long it would take before that life collided again with the one she had left behind, or how much both of them would have to lose, before either of them found their way back to the truth they had both been running from, since the night the rejection mark first burned across her skin. The years did not pass quietly for either of them, though they passed in very different ways. In the border town Ilara came to call home. Life moved slowly and simply, measured in bread loaves baked before dawn, and coins counted at the end of long days. The town was called Millbrook, a modest place tucked between 2 rolling hills, far enough from any pack territory that most of its residents had never seen a true alpha in their lives. Here, no one knew that the quiet young woman working in Mira's bakery had once stood in a royal hall and felt her whole world collapse in front of hundreds of strangers. Ilara had chosen Millbrook for exactly that reason. It was small enough to disappear into, and far enough from the capital, that no wandering noble would ever think to search for a runaway servant there. She kept her wolf hidden entirely, going months at a time without shifting, training herself to walk and speak and live like an ordinary human woman. It was not an easy discipline. Her wolf resented the suppression, pacing restlessly beneath her skin on nights when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky. But the alternative, revealing herself as a wolf and risking discovery, felt far more dangerous than any restlessness she had to endure. Mira, the baker who had taken her in during that first difficult winter, never asked too many questions. She had seen enough broken young women pass through her town to recognize the particular kind of sadness that clung to Alara like a second skin, and she had learned long ago that some wounds healed faster when left alone rather than picked apart. She simply offered Alara a small room above the bakery, a fair wage, and the quiet dignity of being treated like she mattered. It took nearly a year before Alara stopped flinching every time she heard a stranger's raised voice in the market square. It took nearly 2 before she could sleep through an entire night without waking from dreams of shattering wine trays and burning marks, and it took even longer before she allowed herself the smallest sliver of hope that her life could hold something more than survival. That hope arrived, slowly and unexpectedly, in the form of a young craftsman named Callum who repaired wagon wheels in the shop across from the bakery. He was kind in a plain, unremarkable way, the kind of kindness that never demanded anything in return. He brought her fresh flowers on market days, not out of any grand romantic gesture, but simply because he had noticed she liked the color yellow. He never pushed her to speak about her past, and in turn, she never asked him to promise her forever. Alara did not love him, not in the way the old stories described love, not in the way her body had once ached for a stranger's gaze across a crowded hall, but she found comfort in his steadiness, in the ordinary rhythm of a life built on small kindnesses, rather than grand and painful bonds. For the first time since the rejection, she allowed herself to imagine a future that did not orbit entirely around the wound at her throat. Far away, in the capital, Draven's life had taken a very different shape. His marriage to Seraphine functioned exactly as a political marriage was meant to function. They attended council meetings together, hosted diplomatic gatherings together, and presented a unified front to every lord and lady who came seeking favor from the throne. But beneath the polished surface of their partnership, there was no warmth, no laughter, no true companionship. They shared a kingdom, not a life. Seraphine had known from the beginning that Draven did not love her, and to her credit, she had never expected him to. Their marriage was a business arrangement wrapped in ceremonial silk, and she approached it with the same cold practicality she approached everything else. What she had not expected, and what gnawed at her pride more with each passing year, was the way the entire court still whispered about the servant girl from the coronation hall whenever they thought she could not hear. 5 years into their marriage, Seraphine had not given the kingdom an heir. The healers offered no explanation beyond vague reassurances that these things sometimes simply took time, but among the older wolves in the pack, a darker theory had begun to spread, whispered in kitchens and guard barracks and quiet corners of the training yard. A king who rejected his true mate, they said, carried a wound in his very bond that no other joining could ever fully heal. Some claimed it weakened his power, others claimed it cursed his bloodline entirely. Draven refused to acknowledge these rumors publicly, but privately, in the silence of his own chambers, he wondered if the old wolves might be right. He had not forgotten Alara. He told himself countless times over those 5 years that he should have, that a king with a kingdom to run had no business dwelling on a woman he had spoken to only once, for only a handful of seconds, in the middle of the worst decision of his life. But her face returned to him constantly, uninvited, in the quiet moments between council sessions and border patrols. He remembered the exact shade of her eyes, wide with shock and, for one terrible heartbeat, hope. He remembered the sound the wine tray made when it hit the stone floor. His wolf never stopped grieving her. Even after 5 years, even after countless attempts to bury the ache beneath duty and routine, his wolf would occasionally rise in the dead of night, restless and mournful, pacing behind his ribs, as though searching for something it could not name. Draven had learned to live with the ache, the way a soldier learns to live with an old wound, present but manageable, until the day it suddenly was not. That day arrived without warning, in the form of failing crops along the eastern border, and a growing unrest among the pack elders, who had begun to question, more openly than ever before, whether their king's rejected bond had somehow poisoned the strength of the entire territory. Draven found himself summoned before the full council, forced to sit and listen as men twice his age debated his fitness to rule, as though he were not sitting in the very room with them. The land itself seems to sicken alongside its king, argued an elder named Nathaniel, his voice sharp with the particular boldness of a man who had served 3 kings before Draven and feared none of them. We cannot ignore what the old texts tell us about broken bonds. A true alpha's strength flows from his mate bond, whether he wishes to believe the old ways or not. Draven sat rigid on his throne, jaw clenched, refusing to let his composure crack in front of the council. But that night, alone in his chambers, he allowed himself, for the first time in 5 years, to seriously consider the question the elders had been too polite to ask directly. What if they were right? What if the kingdom's decline was not simply bad fortune, but the price of the choice he had made in that coronation hall 5 years ago? He thought of Alara again, as he always did, but this time the thought did not remain a quiet ache in the back of his mind. This time it sharpened into something closer to resolve. He had spent 5 years telling himself that duty had required him to let her go. He had spent 5 years watching that same duty crumble anyway, piece by piece, regardless of the sacrifice he had made to protect it. Perhaps, he thought, as he stood alone on his balcony staring out at the dark shape of the forest, the true failure had never been choosing the crown over the bond. Perhaps the true failure had been believing, even for a moment, that he could keep both his kingdom and his conscience intact, by denying the one thing his wolf had recognized as absolute truth the instant he saw her. He did not act on that thought immediately. A king did not simply abandon his throne on a whim, however heavy his guilt had grown. But the thought took root that night and refused to leave him, growing steadier and more insistent with each passing week, until it became something he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, Alara's quiet life took an unexpected turn of its own. Callum, gentle and patient as ever, asked her to marry him on a warm spring evening beneath the flowering trees that lined the town square. He did not kneel dramatically or offer grand declarations of love. He simply held her hands, told her honestly that he could not promise her the kind of fire the old stories spoke of, but that he could promise her steadiness, kindness, and a life free from the kind of pain that still occasionally shadowed her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Alara did not answer him that night. She told him she needed time, and he, being the patient man he had always been, agreed without complaint. She spent the following days wrestling with a question she had avoided for 5 long years. Could she build a life on steadiness alone, without the fire the old stories promised, without the bond that had once burned so bright it had nearly destroyed her? Or would settling for comfort simply be another kind of running, another way of hiding from a wound that had never actually healed, only scarred over? She did not have an answer yet. But as she stood at her window that night, staring up at the same full moon that hung, unknown to her, over a palace hundreds of miles away, where a king stood on his own balcony, wrestling with the very same unresolved ache, neither of them could have guessed how soon fate would force them both to finally confront the truth they had spent 5 years trying to outrun. The letter arrived on a gray morning in early autumn, carried by one of Draven's most trusted trackers, a broad-shouldered wolf named Alistair who had served the royal family since before Draven was born. He had spent nearly 3 weeks combing through border towns based on nothing more than a faint, years-old rumor that a young woman matching Alara's description had once passed through a settlement called Millbrook. Draven read the report standing in the middle of his private study, his hands trembling so badly that he had to set the parchment down on his desk before he could finish it. Alive, safe, working in a small bakery under a different name, the words blurred together as relief and guilt and something close to desperate hope crashed through him, all at once, 5 years of buried longing rising to the surface in a single overwhelming wave. He did not sleep that night. He sat awake in his study long after the candles had burned low, staring at the map spread across his desk, tracing the distance between the capital and Millbrook with one finger, as though he could somehow shorten it through sheer force of will. His council would never approve of him leaving the capital, not with the border unrest still simmering, not with Godric's pack watching for any sign of weakness. But for the first time in 5 years, Draven found himself no longer caring what his council approved of. He summoned Alistair before dawn and gave him a single order. Prepare 2 horses, tell no one where they were going, and be ready to leave within the hour. Alistair, who had watched his king carry the weight of that coronation hall decision for 5 long years, did not ask a single question. He simply nodded and went to prepare the horses, relief evident in his own weathered face, as though he too had been waiting for this moment far longer than he cared to admit. Draven left a brief note for Seraphine, vague enough to avoid outright confrontation, but honest enough that she would understand exactly where he had gone the moment she read it. He did not wait for her response. He rode out of the palace gates as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope he had not allowed himself to feel in half a decade. The journey to Millbrook took 4 days of hard riding. Draven barely stopped to rest, driven forward by a restless, desperate energy that Alistair recognized as the unmistakable pull of an incomplete mate bond, finally being allowed to seek what it had been denied for so long. Draven's wolf paced beneath his skin with every mile, growing more insistent the closer they drew to the small border town, until by the final day, Draven could barely maintain his human form long enough to stay mounted on his horse. They arrived in Millbrook on a quiet afternoon, the town bathed in warm autumn light, the streets filled with the ordinary bustle of market day. Draven dismounted at the edge of town, his heart hammering so hard he was certain everyone around him could hear it. He did not need directions to find the bakery. His wolf pulled him forward, with an instinct too powerful to resist, weaving through the crowded market square, as though an invisible thread connected his chest directly to hers. He stopped outside Mira's bakery, and simply stood there for a long moment, staring at the modest wooden building, with its warm, flower-scented air drifting out through the open door. 5 years of guilt, longing, and unresolved grief rose in his throat all at once, and for the first time since he had become king, Draven Ashworth felt genuinely afraid. He pushed open the door. Elara was behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, flour dusting her forearms as she carefully wrapped a loaf of bread for an elderly customer. She was laughing softly at something the woman had said, a warm, genuine sound that Draven had never once heard from her, not even in the brief, painful seconds of their first meeting 5 years ago. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway and watched her, memorizing the sight of a life she had built entirely without him. Then she looked up, and everything in her expression shattered at once. The bread slipped from her hands and landed on the counter with a soft thud. Her eyes went wide, her breath catching audibly in her throat, and for one long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The elderly customer glanced between them, sensing the sudden thickness in the air, and quietly excused herself from the shop, without waiting for her change. "You should not be here," Elara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with an emotion Draven could not immediately name. It was not the soft, hopeful voice he remembered from the coronation hall. It was harder now, guarded, layered with 5 years of scar tissue built up around a wound that had never properly healed. "I know," Draven said, stepping further into the small shop, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I gave up any claim to your forgiveness the moment I spoke those words in front of that hall, but I could not stay away any longer. I have tried, Elara. 5 years, and I could not stay away." Her name in his mouth sent a visible tremor through her body. She braced both hands against the counter, as though she needed the support to remain standing. Her eyes glistening with tears, she refused to let fall in front of him. "You do not get to say my name like that," she said, her voice sharpening with a fury that had clearly been building for half a decade. "You do not get to walk into my life after 5 years and act as though you have any right to the feelings you buried the moment you called me nothing in front of your entire kingdom." "I never believed you were nothing," Draven said, his voice raw with an honesty he had never allowed himself to speak aloud before. "I have thought of you every single day since that morning. I have regretted what I said more than I have regretted anything in my entire life. I was wrong, Elara. I was a coward, and I let my fear of losing my kingdom convince me that I had no other choice." "You had a choice," Elara said, her voice breaking now, despite her efforts to stay composed. "You chose your crown. You chose it in front of hundreds of people, and then you married her anyway, and you let me disappear without a single word for 5 years. So do not stand in my shop and tell me you had no choice, because we both know that is a lie." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he did not try to deny them, because they were true. He had made a choice, and it had cost her everything. "You are right," he said quietly. "I did have a choice, and I made the wrong one. I am not here to ask you to forgive me for that. I know 5 years cannot be undone with an apology. But I needed you to know the truth, that leaving you was the greatest mistake of my life, and that I have never once stopped feeling the bond between us, no matter how hard I tried to bury it beneath duty." Elara wiped at her eyes with the back of her flour-dusted hand, furious at herself for the tears she could not fully stop. "I built a life here," she said, her voice steadier now, though still thick with emotion. "A quiet life. A safe life. I have people here who care about me, who never once made me feel like I was something to be discarded for the sake of politics. I do not need you to come back into my life and remind me of everything I worked so hard to leave behind." "I am not asking you to abandon that life," Draven said, though the words cost him more than he expected. "I am not here to demand anything from you, Elara. I only needed to see you, to tell you the truth, and to make certain you were safe. If that is all I am allowed, then I will accept it, even if it destroys me." Before Elara could respond, the bakery door swung open again, and Callum stepped inside, his easy smile faltering the moment he registered the tension thick in the air between the two strangers standing in front of the counter. His eyes moved from Alara's tear-streaked face to the tall, imposing stranger standing across from her, and something in his expression shifted, a quiet, dawning understanding settling over his features. "Elara," Callum said carefully, stepping further into the shop. "Is everything all right?" Elara opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. She looked between the two men, caught in a moment she had never imagined she would have to face, the past and the life she had built colliding in the small, flower-scented space of Mira's bakery. Draven watched the exchange with a tightness building in his chest, a low, possessive growl rising in his throat that he forced himself to suppress with considerable effort. "I think," Callum said slowly, his gaze settling on Draven with a careful, measured wariness, "that perhaps I should come back later." He left without waiting for an answer, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything Draven had experienced in 5 long years of ruling a kingdom. Elara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the collision of 2 worlds she had never expected to see meet. "You need to leave," she finally whispered, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried only minutes before. "Please, Draven, just go." He wanted, more than anything, to close the distance between them, to reach for her, the way his wolf had been screaming at him to do, since the moment he walked through that door. But he forced himself to nod instead, respecting the fragile boundary she had drawn between them, even as every instinct in his body rebelled against it. "I will go," he said quietly, "but I am not leaving Millbrook, Elara. Not yet. I owe you 5 years of truth, and I intend to give it to you, in whatever way you will allow." He turned and walked out of the bakery, leaving Elara standing alone behind the counter, her heart pounding with a chaos of emotions she had spent 5 years trying to convince herself she would never feel again. Outside, the autumn sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, indifferent to the storm that had just begun to gather over the quiet, unsuspecting town of Millbrook. Neither Elara nor Draven yet understood how quickly that storm would grow, or how far its reach would eventually extend. But somewhere far beyond the peaceful borders of Millbrook, word of the king's disappearance had already begun to travel, carried on whispers that would soon reach ears far less forgiving than Alara's own. News of the Alpha King's disappearance reached the capital's council chambers within 2 days, and it reached Seraphine's private quarters within 2 hours. She read Draven's brief, vague note 3 times, before setting it down on her writing desk, with hands that remained, outwardly, perfectly steady. Inwardly, something cold and furious had begun to coil tight in her chest, a fury that had been simmering quietly beneath the surface of her composed marriage for 5 long years, finally given a clear and specific target. She had always known about the servant girl. Everyone at court had known, whispered about it in corners, and guarded conversations for years, though no one had dared speak of it openly in front of the queen herself. Seraphine had endured the humiliation of that knowledge with the same cold discipline she applied to everything else in her carefully constructed life, telling herself that whatever lingering feelings her husband harbored for a servant he had rejected did not matter, so long as the crown and the treaty between their two packs remained secure. But now Draven had abandoned his throne, his council, and his duties, all to chase after the very woman he had publicly denied on his coronation day. The insult was no longer private. It was no longer something Seraphine could bury beneath dignity and silence. Her husband had made his choice clear to an entire kingdom once again, and this time, Seraphine had no intention of absorbing that humiliation quietly. She summoned a messenger before nightfall and dictated a letter to her father, Alpha Godric, informing him of Draven's disappearance and the reason behind it. She did not ask for his intervention outright. She did not need to. Godric had spent 5 years searching for any excuse to reclaim the territory his pack had lost in the original treaty negotiations, and Seraphine knew precisely how her father would interpret this news. Godric's response arrived within a week, delivered not by messenger, but by Godric himself, arriving at the capital with a full contingent of his personal guard. He requested an immediate audience with the council, and though several of Draven's most loyal advisors attempted to delay the meeting until the king's return, Godric's presence, combined with Seraphine's quiet, calculated support, made delay impossible. "Your king has abandoned his throne to chase after a servant girl he humiliated in front of my daughter and this entire court 5 years ago," Godric announced to the assembled council, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding armies. "He has broken the spirit of our treaty, if not its exact letter, and I will not stand by while my daughter's honor, and the honor of my entire pack, is treated with such careless disregard." The council chamber erupted into heated debate. Some of Draven's advisors argued passionately in his defense, insisting that a king's personal affairs should not be conflated with matters of state. Others, particularly the elders, who had long suspected that Draven's rejected bond had cursed the kingdom's fortunes, seized the opportunity to voice years of accumulated grievance. Nathaniel, the same elder who had confronted Draven months earlier, rose to speak with grim satisfaction. "We warned him," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the chaos of the chamber. "We warned him that a broken bond weakens more than just a man's heart. It weakens his judgment, his ability to lead, his very connection to the pack he has sworn to protect. Now we see the proof of that warning laid bare before us. Our king has abandoned his post in pursuit of a bond he should have honored from the very beginning." Seraphine, seated at the head table beside her father, said little during the debate, allowing the council members to argue among themselves, while she watched with calculated patience. She did not need to argue Draven's guilt. The council was doing that work for her, fueled by years of resentment that had only been waiting for the right spark to ignite. By the end of that long and contentious meeting, the council had voted to strip Draven of several key powers during his absence, placing temporary authority over border negotiations and military command in the hands of a regent council, led jointly by Seraphine and 2 of the eldest pack elders. It was not a full removal of his throne, not yet, but it was a clear and unmistakable message. The king's authority had been publicly and formally questioned for the first time in his reign. Word of the council's decision reached Draven in Millbrook 4 days later, delivered by a grim-faced Alistair, who had ridden hard from the capital the moment the vote concluded. Draven read the formal notice standing outside the small inn, where he had been staying since his arrival in the border town, his expression darkening with each line. "They cannot simply strip a king of his authority without his presence or consent," Draven said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "This is not how our laws function, Alistair. This is Godric maneuvering to seize control while I am away, nothing more." "Perhaps," Alistair said carefully, "but the council voted my king, and Godric's presence in the capital carries considerable weight, especially now that Seraphine has aligned herself openly with her father's position. If you do not return soon, I fear this temporary measure will become considerably less temporary." Draven closed his eyes, torn between 2 competing responsibilities that felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely irreconcilable. Returning to the capital meant confronting a council increasingly hostile to his rule, and possibly losing what little ground he had gained toward eventually winning back Elara's trust. Staying in Millbrook meant risking the stability of his entire kingdom, giving Godric exactly the opening he needed to consolidate power, under the guise of protecting his daughter's honor. He found Elara that evening, at the edge of a quiet pond, just beyond the town's boundary. a place she had apparently taken to visiting in the evenings since his arrival. Whether to think, or simply to escape the growing tension his presence had introduced into her carefully rebuilt life, he could not be certain. She did not look surprised to see him approach, though her posture remained guarded, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "I heard what happened at the Capitol," she said before he could speak, her voice quiet but not unkind. "Word travels even to small towns like this one. Eventually, your council has moved against you." "They have," Draven admitted, settling onto the grass a respectful distance from where she sat. "And I find myself facing a choice I never expected to face. Return to defend my throne, or remain here and continue trying to prove to you that I meant every word I said in that bakery." Elara studied him for a long moment, the evening light catching the golden flecks in her eyes, a detail Draven found himself memorizing despite the weight of everything else pressing down on him. "You should return," she finally said, though something in her voice suggested the words cost her more than she wanted to admit. "Your kingdom needs you, Draven. Thousands of people depend on the stability you provide. I will not be the reason you lose everything you have spent your entire life building." "And if I told you," Draven said carefully, "that I am no longer certain the kingdom, and you are separate choices, that perhaps the reason everything has been falling apart these past 5 years is precisely because I chose one over the other in that hall, and that choice has been poisoning everything since?" Elara looked away, staring out at the darkening water of the pond, clearly wrestling with thoughts she was not yet ready to voice aloud. "I do not know what to do with that," she admitted quietly. "I spent 5 years convincing myself that you were simply a mistake, a painful chapter I needed to close so I could build something real. And now you are sitting here telling me that closing that chapter might have broken something far larger than either of us understood at the time." "I am not asking you to decide anything tonight," Draven said gently. "I only need you to know that whatever happens when I return to the capital, whatever battles I face with my council, with Godric, with the life I built without you in it, none of that changes the truth of what I feel every time I am near you. That has never once wavered, not in 5 years, not for a single day." They sat together in silence for a long while after that, the evening deepening around them, neither quite ready to bridge the distance still separating them, but both, for the first time, no longer entirely certain that the distance was as permanent as they had once believed. Draven left for the capital the following morning, promising Elara he would return once the council crisis had been resolved, though neither of them could have predicted just how quickly that promise would be tested. Behind him, in Millbrook, Elara returned to her quiet life at the bakery, though the quiet no longer felt quite as peaceful as it once had, her thoughts now permanently divided between the steady, gentle life she had built with Callum and the storm of unresolved feeling that had followed the Alpha King into her small, unsuspecting town. Neither of them yet knew that Godric had already begun making plans that extended far beyond a simple council vote, plans that would soon bring war, danger, and irreversible consequence crashing down upon the fragile peace both Elara and Draven had spent years trying, in their own separate ways, to protect. The council chamber fell into stunned silence the moment Draven strode through its heavy doors, still dressed in the traveling clothes he had worn on his ride back from Millbrook, his expression carved from granite. Godric rose from his seat at the head table with an air of practiced calm, though his eyes flickered with something sharper the moment he registered the fire burning behind his king's gaze. "My king returns," Godric said smoothly, spreading his hands in a gesture of false welcome. "We had begun to wonder if you intended to abandon your throne entirely, in favor of a servant girl's bakery. You had no authority to strip powers from my rule in my absence," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying the particular stillness of a wolf, holding its temper by the barest thread. "This council answers to me, not to a foreign alpha who happens to share blood with my wife." The vote was legal and properly conducted, Nathaniel interjected from his seat, though even he seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of Draven's glare. "Your prolonged absence during a period of active border tension left this kingdom vulnerable, my king. We acted to protect it, nothing more." Draven's gaze swept across the assembled council members, most of whom avoided meeting his eyes directly, before finally settling on Seraphine, seated calmly beside her father, with an expression of perfect composure. "And you," he said quietly. "You allowed your father to walk into my council chamber and strip authority from my throne while I was away." "I allowed the council to act in the kingdom's best interest," Seraphine replied evenly. The same way I have acted in this kingdom's best interest for 5 years, Draven, despite the fact that you never once gave me the same consideration in return. The accusation landed with more weight than Draven expected, and for a moment, genuine guilt flickered across his features, before hardening once again into resolve. I understand that our marriage was never what either of us truly wanted, he said, addressing Seraphine directly now, his voice softer, but no less firm. And I understand that I have failed you in ways I cannot fully undo. But I will not allow that failure to be used as justification for stripping this kingdom's rightful authority away from the throne my father died protecting. Then perhaps, Godric said, his composure finally beginning to crack around the edges, you should have considered the consequences of chasing a servant girl before you abandoned your responsibilities to run after her. My daughter has endured 5 years of quiet humiliation for the sake of peace between our packs, and I will not watch her endure further disgrace, while you play at being a lovesick fool in some border village bakery. Draven's wolf surged forward at the insult, a low growl building in his chest that he barely managed to contain. Choose your next words carefully, Godric, he warned. You are still a guest within these walls, regardless of the treaty between our houses. The tension in the chamber stretched taut, every council member holding their breath, until finally, Godric inclined his head, in a small, deliberately insincere gesture of respect. Of course, my king, he said, though the mockery in his tone remained unmistakable. I only wish to see this kingdom, and my daughter, protected from further disgrace. Perhaps a formal declaration would ease everyone's concerns. A public reaffirmation of your commitment to your marriage and your throne, made before the full court, would go a long way toward restoring the stability this council fears has been lost. It was, Draven realized immediately, a trap dressed in the language of reconciliation. A public reaffirmation of his marriage would mean publicly denying Elara a second time, cementing the very choice he had spent 5 years regretting, this time with no possibility of ever undoing it. He looked at Seraphine, searching her expression for some sign of what she truly wanted, but her face remained a careful, unreadable mask. I will not make that declaration, Draven said finally, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. I have spent 5 years living a lie, built on the belief that duty and truth could never coexist. I was wrong. I will not compound that mistake by standing before this court and denying, once again, the bond that has never once released its hold on me, regardless of how inconvenient that truth has proven to be for this council's political comfort. The chamber erupted into chaos. Nathaniel rose to his feet, shouting something about the sanctity of treaties and the dangers of a king ruled by sentiment rather than duty. Other council members shouted over one another, some defending Draven's right to make his own personal choices, others siding openly with Godric's outrage. Seraphine sat motionless through it all, her expression finally cracking just enough to reveal something that looked, for one brief moment, almost like relief. Godric slammed his hand against the table, silencing the chamber with the force of the blow. Then I withdraw my daughter and my pack's support from this treaty entirely, he announced, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. Let it be known throughout every allied territory that Alpha King Draven Ashworth has chosen a servant girl's bed over the peace of his own kingdom. Let the consequences of that choice fall entirely upon his shoulders. He turned and stormed from the chamber, his personal guard falling into step behind him, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Seraphine rose more slowly, casting one final unreadable glance toward Draven, before following her father toward the doors. Seraphine, Draven called after her, and she paused, her back still turned to him. Whatever happens next, I am sorry for the years I spent making you feel like an obligation, rather than a person deserving of genuine care. You deserved better than the marriage I gave you. She turned part way, just enough for him to see the ghost of something almost like understanding cross her features. I know, she said quietly. And for what it is worth, Draven, I hope you find whatever peace you have been searching for. I only wish it had not cost so much for both of us to discover we were never meant to find it in each other. She left without another word, and the chamber doors closed behind her with a heavy, final sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence of the council chamber. Draven stood alone amid the scattered remains of a council meeting that had just fractured his kingdom's most important alliance. fully aware that Godric's threat had not been idle posturing. Within days, reports began arriving from the eastern border of increased troop movements within Godric's territory. Villages that had grown accustomed to years of relative peace began reporting unfamiliar patrols along the border roads. Draven called an emergency meeting with his remaining loyal advisors. The fractures within his own council now laid bare for everyone to see. Some elders, including Nathaniel, made no secret of their belief that Draven's choice had brought this looming conflict entirely upon himself. "You had a treaty that guaranteed peace," Nathaniel said bluntly during that emergency meeting, "and you chose a personal bond over the safety of this entire kingdom. I hope, for all our sakes, that whatever you found in that border town proves worth the cost we are all about to pay." Draven did not have an answer that satisfied the elder's accusation, because some part of him feared that Nathaniel might be right, that his choice, however true it felt in his heart, might yet cost far more than he was prepared to sacrifice. But beneath that fear, something steadier had also taken root, a conviction that had been building steadily since the moment he watched Ilara's face crumble in that coronation hall 5 years ago. He had spent 5 years paying the price for denying his mate bond, watching his kingdom weaken and fracture, regardless of the sacrifice he believed he had made to protect it. Perhaps, he thought grimly, as reports of Godric's mobilizing forces continued arriving throughout that long and tense week, the true weakness had never been his devotion to Ilara. Perhaps the true weakness had always been the years he spent denying it. Whatever came next, whatever war Godric intended to bring to his borders, Draven resolved that he would face it without repeating the mistake that had brought them to this precipice in the first place. He would not deny Ilara again, not to save a treaty, not to save a crown, not even to save the fragile peace his father had died trying to build. If war was coming regardless of his choices, then he intended to face it as the man he should have been from the very beginning, not the frightened, dutiful king who had traded his heart for a fragile and ultimately unsustainable peace. Far away in Millbrook, unaware of the storm rapidly gathering along the eastern border, Ilara received a letter from Draven explaining, in careful and measured words, exactly what had transpired within the council chamber. She read it standing behind the bakery counter, her hands trembling as the weight of the situation settled over her. War, the letter warned, might soon reach even quiet border towns like Millbrook, and Draven urged her, for her own safety, to consider relocating somewhere further from the contested territories. Ilara folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, staring out the bakery window at the peaceful, unsuspecting streets of the only true home she had built for herself in 5 long years. She did not yet know that Godric's forces had already begun identifying Millbrook as a strategic target, not for its resources or position, but for a far more personal and dangerous reason entirely. The soldiers arrived at dawn, moving through Millbrook's quiet streets with a coordinated silence that spoke of careful planning, rather than chaotic invasion. By the time the first residents woke to the sound of marching boots against cobblestone, Godric's forces had already surrounded the town's perimeter, cutting off every road leading toward the capital or any neighboring settlement that might send word of what was happening. Ilara woke to the sound of Mira pounding frantically on her bedroom door, the older woman's voice tight with fear. "Soldiers," Mira gasped the moment Ilara opened the door, still half-dressed and disoriented from sleep. "Godric's soldiers, throughout the entire town. They are asking about you, Ilara. They know your name." The cold reality of it hit Ilara like a physical blow. Godric had not simply mobilized his forces along the border, out of general aggression toward Draven's kingdom. He had come specifically for her, using her as the final piece needed to justify a war he had clearly been planning for far longer than the recent council meeting alone could explain. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking, torn between the instinct to run and the growing realization that running might no longer be an option. Callum arrived at the bakery moments later, his expression grim, having witnessed the soldiers' movements firsthand on his way from his own shop. "They have blocked every road out of town," he confirmed, confirming Ilara's worst fears. "I do not know what they want, but they are searching house to house, and it will not take them long to reach the bakery." It did not take long at all. Within the hour, a contingent of Godric's soldiers arrived at Mira's bakery, led by a hard-faced captain who required only a single glance at Ilara's face to confirm her identity against whatever description he had been given. She did not resist as they took hold of her arms, some small, exhausted part of her recognizing the grim inevitability of the moment, though Callum fought fiercely against the soldiers restraining him from intervening, earning himself a blow to the head that left him crumpled and unconscious on the bakery floor. "Callum!" Ilara screamed, struggling against the soldiers' grip, but they were already dragging her toward the street, where a covered wagon waited to transport her away from the only home she had built for herself in 5 long years. Mira stood frozen in the bakery doorway, tears streaming down her weathered face, utterly powerless to help, as Ilara was forced into the wagon, and the door slammed shut behind her. The journey to Godric's territory took 2 full days, during which Ilara was given little food, less water, and no information whatsoever about what awaited her upon arrival. She spent the long hours turning the situation over in her mind, trying to understand exactly what purpose her capture was meant to serve. If Godric wanted her dead, his soldiers could have accomplished that within Millbrook's streets, without the trouble of transporting her across an entire territory. He wanted something more specific than her simple death. He wanted, she eventually realized with a growing sense of dread, leverage. Word of Ilara's capture reached Draven within a day, delivered by a grim-faced messenger who had ridden through the night to bring the news. Draven read the report standing in his private study, and for the first time since taking the throne, his composure shattered entirely. He overturned his writing desk, sending papers and inkwells crashing across the stone floor, his wolf surging forward with a fury so intense that the guards stationed outside his door retreated several steps, at the sound of his roar, echoing through the palace corridors. "Prepare every warrior in my service," Draven ordered Alistair the moment he regained enough control to speak clearly. "We march for Godric's territory within the hour." "My king," Alistair said carefully, "marching an army across the border, without formal declaration, will be seen as an act of war, by every allied territory watching our borders. Godric has been waiting for exactly this response. He wants you to march in blind fury, so he can paint you as the aggressor before the eyes of every pack in the northern territories." Draven forced himself to breathe, fighting against the desperate, animal instinct screaming at him to tear through anything standing between himself and Ilara's rescue. "Then what would you have me do, Alistair? Sit here in this palace while she suffers in his territory, because I fear how it will look to Pax, who have already shown they care more for political convenience than genuine justice." "I would have you march smart, rather than march angry," Alistair replied evenly. "Send word to every ally who still respects the original treaty terms. Explain clearly that Godric has kidnapped an innocent woman to provoke a war of his own making. Gather support before you gather swords. It will cost us days we may not wish to spare, but it will ensure that when we do march, the entire Northern Territory understands exactly who bears responsibility for whatever violence follows." Draven hated every word of the advice, precisely because he knew it was sound. He spent the following 3 days in a blur of furious diplomatic activity, sending messengers to every allied pack, explaining Godric's actions in careful, damning detail, securing pledges of support from territories that had grown weary of Godric's increasingly aggressive posturing over the years. By the end of those 3 agonizing days, Draven had assembled not just his own kingdom's forces, but a coalition of allied warriors from 4 separate territories, all united by a shared unwillingness to allow Godric's blatant provocation to stand unanswered. Meanwhile, in Godric's stronghold, Ilara was brought before the Alpha himself, in a grand hall that bore an unsettling resemblance to the one where her entire life had first shattered 5 years earlier. Godric sat upon an imposing stone throne, studying her with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who viewed every person and situation purely in terms of their usefulness to his ambitions. "You have caused a great deal of trouble for a simple servant girl," Godric observed, his tone carrying a mixture of contempt and grudging curiosity. "I confess, I do not entirely understand what quality you possess that has driven an Alpha King to abandon his throne and his marriage in pursuit of you. But your existence has proven remarkably useful to my own purposes, regardless of whatever mysterious appeal you hold for him. What do you want from me?" Ilara demanded, forcing steel into her voice, despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "If you intend to kill me, then do it, but do not pretend this is anything other than what it clearly is. You are using me as bait to draw Draven into a war you have wanted to start for years." Godric's lips curled into a thin, appreciative smile. "Clever girl. Yes. That is precisely the shape of my intentions. Your king abandoned my daughter's honor for the sake of a bond he should have denied permanently, and now I intend to make him understand the true cost of that choice. When his forces arrive at my borders seeking your rescue, as I have no doubt they will find themselves marching directly into a position I have spent years preparing for exactly this purpose." Alara felt cold dread settle over her at the implication. Godric had not simply captured her out of spite or opportunism. He had planned this confrontation meticulously, using her as the precise instrument needed to lure Draven's forces into a carefully constructed trap. "You would start a war that will cost thousands of lives," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief, "purely to satisfy your wounded pride over a rejected marriage arrangement." "Pride," Godric said, rising from his throne with slow, deliberate menace, "is precisely what holds fragile alliances like ours together, girl. When a king insults an alpha's daughter publicly, not once but twice, that insult demands a response proportional to the humiliation endured. I have spent years building the military strength necessary to reclaim the territory my pack lost in that original treaty, and your king has now handed me the perfect justification to finally act on those long-standing ambitions." He gestured toward the guards flanking Alara, and they moved to escort her toward a heavily guarded chamber deep within the stronghold, where she would remain, Godric informed her coldly, until Draven's forces arrived and either surrendered to his demands or suffered the consequences of refusing them. As the guards led her away, Alara caught one final glimpse of Godric settling back into his throne, a satisfied, predatory expression spreading across his weathered features, and understood with sickening clarity exactly how dangerous the trap awaiting Draven had truly become. She spent the following days in careful, quiet observation, memorizing the layout of the stronghold, the patterns of the guards' rotations, and the general disposition of Godric's forces, though she had no clear plan yet for how such information might prove useful. She thought constantly of Draven, torn between desperate hope that he would come for her, and equally desperate fear of exactly what awaited him if he did. She also thought, with a pang of guilt she could not quite suppress, of Callum, left bleeding and unconscious on the bakery floor, and of Mira, watching helplessly as soldiers dragged away the young woman she had sheltered and cared for over 5 quiet years. Whatever happened next, Alara understood with growing certainty that the peaceful, hidden life she had built for herself in Millbrook was gone forever, swept away by the same relentless forces that had once driven her from the capital in the first place. Outside the stronghold's walls, though she could not yet see it, Draven's coalition forces had already begun their march toward Godric's territory, banners bearing the colors of 5 allied packs rippling in the wind, as thousands of warriors advanced steadily toward a confrontation that would determine far more than the fate of a single rejected mate bond. It would determine the future of the entire northern territory, and neither Godric nor Draven nor Alara herself fully understood yet just how catastrophic the coming days would prove to be. Draven's coalition army reached the outskirts of Godric's territory on a cold, overcast morning, 5 allied banners snapping sharply in the wind, above thousands of assembled warriors. Draven rode at the very front of the formation, his expression carved from ice, every ounce of the desperate fury he had carried since learning of Alara's capture, now channeled into a cold, focused determination that his advisors found far more unsettling than his earlier rage had been. Alistair rode beside him, studying the distant walls of Godric's stronghold through narrowed eyes. "His forces have fortified their position considerably since our last intelligence reports," he observed grimly. "This confrontation will not be simple, my king. Godric has clearly been preparing for this exact moment, for longer than we anticipated." "Then we adjust our approach accordingly," Draven replied, his voice tight with restrained tension. "But we do not retreat, Alistair. Alara is inside those walls, and I will not leave this territory without her, regardless of what defenses Godric believes he has prepared." They made camp within sight of the stronghold that evening, and Draven spent the following 2 days engaged in careful, methodical preparation rather than the reckless assault his wolf desperately urged him toward. He sent scouts to map the stronghold's defenses, coordinated strategy with the leaders of his allied forces, and resisted every instinct screaming at him to simply tear through the walls with his bare hands and reclaim what had been stolen from him. On the 3rd morning, Godric sent a formal message to Draven's camp, delivered by a lone rider under a flag of parley. The message was brief and unmistakably taunting in its careful phrasing. Godric proposed a formal negotiation, offering to discuss terms for Alara's release, though the message made clear that any such terms would come at a significant cost to Draven's kingdom and pride. Draven agreed to the negotiation, though every instinct warned him it was likely another layer of Godric's carefully constructed trap. He rode alone to the designated meeting point outside the stronghold's main gate, accompanied only by Alistair and a small honor guard, while the bulk of his coalition forces remained positioned at a careful distance, ready to respond to whatever developed. Godric emerged from the stronghold gates with a similarly small escort, his expression carrying the smug confidence of a man who believed he held every advantage in the confrontation ahead. "I confess I did not expect you to actually assemble such an impressive coalition on behalf of a mere servant girl," Godric observed as the two alphas faced each other across the negotiating space. "It seems the rumors of your devotion were not exaggerated after all." "State your terms, Godric," Draven said, refusing to indulge the older alpha's provocations. "I did not march 4 allied territories to your borders to exchange pleasantries." Godric's expression sharpened. "Very well. My terms are simple. You will formally dissolve any remaining claim to the treaty between our territories, publicly acknowledge my pack's independence from your kingdom's authority, and cede the eastern border territories that originally justified our alliance. In exchange, I will release the girl unharmed." "And if I refuse those terms?" Draven asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Then the girl remains within my walls," Godric said coldly, "and your coalition forces will discover exactly how thoroughly I have prepared for this confrontation. I have spent 5 years anticipating this exact moment, Draven. Do not mistake my daughter's quiet dignity these past years for genuine forgiveness of the humiliation your kingdom inflicted upon our family." Draven studied the older alpha carefully, searching for any sign of bluff or weakness in his confident posture, but found none. Godric genuinely believed he held every advantage in this confrontation, and that certainty made him considerably more dangerous than a desperate man might have been. "I will not cede territory that belongs rightfully to my kingdom," Draven finally said, "and I will not dissolve a treaty under duress, purely to satisfy your ambitions for expanded power. But I will offer you this: release Alara unharmed, and I will personally guarantee that no coalition forces cross into your territory beyond this point. We withdraw peacefully, and this confrontation ends without further bloodshed." Godric laughed, a short, humorless sound that carried genuine contempt. "You misunderstand the nature of our negotiation, my king. I am not asking for your permission to keep what I already possess. I am informing you of the price required to reclaim it. Choose your response carefully, because I assure you, my forces are more than prepared to demonstrate the consequences of refusal." The negotiation ended without resolution, both alphas returning to their respective forces with the confrontation now clearly inevitable. Draven spent that night in restless, furious planning, his advisors debating strategy long into the darkness, while scouts continued gathering intelligence on the stronghold's defenses and troop positions. Inside the stronghold, Alara had spent her days of captivity, carefully cultivating what limited trust she could with the guards assigned to her chamber, learning through careful, patient observation that Godric's forces, while impressively organized, held a significant weakness in the eastern section of the stronghold's defenses, where recent construction had left a section of the outer wall less thoroughly fortified than the rest. She had no direct way to communicate this information to Draven's forces, trapped as she was within heavily guarded quarters, but she resolved to remain alert for any opportunity that might present itself, refusing to simply wait passively for whatever violence Godric's confrontation with Draven would ultimately bring. That opportunity arrived on the 4th night of the standoff, when a young guard named Tobias, clearly uncomfortable with the role he had been assigned in Godric's scheme, brought Alara her evening meal, with visible hesitation written across his youthful features. "I do not agree with what the Alpha is doing," he admitted quietly, glancing nervously toward the chamber door to ensure no one else could overhear. "My own sister was once dismissed from a noble household under circumstances not unlike your own. I have no love for using an innocent woman as a weapon in someone else's political war." Alara studied the young guard carefully, recognizing in his uncertain expression a potential ally she had not expected to find within Godric's own ranks. "Then help me," she said quietly, urgently. "Not to escape necessarily, but to end this before more people are hurt on both sides of this conflict. Tell me honestly, is there any way for me to reach Draven's forces directly, to explain what I have observed about the stronghold's defenses, or to simply demonstrate that I am not being harmed, in hopes of preventing further escalation? Tobias hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing the enormous risk such assistance would represent. There is a narrow passage, he finally admitted, used by servants moving between the kitchens and the eastern gardens. It connects to a section of the outer wall that remains lightly guarded during the night rotation. I could not guarantee your safety beyond that point, but it would at least grant you passage outside these chamber walls. It was not the plan Alara might have hoped for, uncertain and dangerous as it was, but it represented the first genuine opportunity she had encountered since her capture, and she resolved immediately to take it. Thank you, she said sincerely. Whatever happens next, I will not forget the risk you are taking to help me. That night, under cover of darkness, Tobias guided Alara through the narrow servants' passage, both of them moving with careful, deliberate silence past the stronghold's lighter night patrols. They reached the eastern wall section without incident, and Tobias pointed toward a narrow gap in the fortifications where recent construction had left the defenses genuinely vulnerable, precisely as Alara had observed during her captivity. Beyond this point, you are on your own, Tobias whispered, clear fear evident in his young voice, despite his evident conviction in the choice he had made. I cannot follow further without certainly revealing my involvement, and Godric's punishment for such disloyalty would be severe. I wish you safety, whatever path you choose from here. Alara thanked him once more, before slipping through the vulnerable section of wall, emerging into the cold night air, beyond the stronghold's fortifications, for the first time since her capture. She had no clear plan for what came next, no certainty of finding Draven's forces safely in the darkness, but the simple fact of standing outside those walls, breathing air that was not thick with the tension of captivity, filled her with a fierce, determined hope she had not expected to feel again. She began moving carefully through the darkness, following the distant glow of what she hoped were Draven's coalition campfires, unaware that her escape had already been discovered within the stronghold, and that Godric's forces were even now mobilizing in furious pursuit, determined to reclaim their most valuable piece of leverage before the confrontation with Draven's coalition could reach its inevitable, violent conclusion. The alarm horn sounded across Godric's stronghold within the hour, its harsh, urgent tone cutting through the cold night air and carrying clearly across the distance to Draven's coalition camp. Draven, who had been pacing restlessly through his tent, unable to find sleep, froze the instant he heard it, his wolf immediately recognizing the sound as a signal of chaos within enemy walls. Something has happened, he said to Alistair, who had rushed into the tent at the sound of the alarm. Prepare the scouts immediately. I want to know exactly what has triggered that response. He did not need to wait long for an answer. Within minutes, one of his forward scouts returned at a full sprint, breathless with urgent news. My king, movement has been spotted beyond the stronghold's eastern wall. A single figure, moving through the darkness toward our position. Godric's forces appear to be mobilizing in pursuit. Draven's heart seized with a sudden, desperate certainty. Alara, he breathed, already moving toward his horse, before Alistair could offer any counsel about caution or strategy. Mobilize the coalition forces immediately. Whatever is happening, we move to intercept now. He rode out into the darkness with a small contingent of his fastest riders, his wolf senses straining through the cold night air for any trace of the scent he had spent 5 years unable to forget. He found it faster than he expected, a familiar, achingly recognizable presence cutting through the darkness like a beacon, and he pushed his horse harder, desperation overriding every ounce of tactical caution he had maintained throughout the careful negotiations of the previous days. He found her running through a shallow valley between the stronghold and the coalition camp, Godric's pursuing forces visible in the distance behind her, closing the gap with alarming speed. Draven did not hesitate. He leaped from his horse while it was still moving, shifting into his full wolf form in a single fluid motion, the transformation happening faster and more completely than it ever had in his entire life. 5 years of suppressed grief and fury, finally given an outlet worthy of their intensity. Alara saw him coming, a massive, powerful wolf form moving through the darkness with a speed that seemed almost unnatural, and despite the exhaustion and fear of the past several days, something in her chest loosened with pure, overwhelming relief. She did not slow her own pace, continuing to run toward him even as Godric's pursuing forces closed in from behind, several of their own warriors beginning to shift in preparation for confrontation. Draven reached her within moments, shifting back to his human form just long enough to pull her into his arms, checking frantically for any sign of injury, even as he positioned his body protectively between her and the approaching threat. "I have you," he said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "I have you, Alara. You are safe." "They are right behind me," she gasped, still catching her breath from the desperate run across the valley. "Draven, there are too many of them. You cannot fight them all alone." "I am not alone," he said grimly, and as if summoned by his words, the sound of thundering hooves and howling wolves announced the arrival of his coalition forces, riding hard to close the distance between the camp and the confrontation now unfolding in the valley below the stronghold's walls. What followed was chaotic and fierce, though Draven fought with a controlled, focused intensity that surprised even his own warriors, who had never witnessed their king unleash the full extent of his bloodline's power in actual combat. He kept himself positioned protectively near Alara throughout the confrontation, meeting every threat that came near her, with an efficient, decisive force that quickly discouraged Godric's pursuing warriors from pressing their pursuit any further into coalition territory. Godric himself arrived at the edge of the valley moments later, having been informed of Alara's escape and the subsequent confrontation, his expression twisted with fury at seeing his carefully constructed leverage slip so completely from his grasp. He shifted into his own imposing wolf form, clearly intending to personally reclaim what he viewed as rightfully his to control. But the sight of the assembled coalition forces, now fully mobilized and vastly outnumbering his own pursuing contingent, gave even the confident Alpha genuine pause. Draven stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Godric and Alara, his expression carrying a cold, absolute resolve that left no room for further negotiation or compromise. "This ends now, Godric," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the valley, despite not being raised to a shout. "You have lost your leverage, and you now face a coalition of 5 territories united against your ambitions. Withdraw your forces, or face the consequences of a war you cannot possibly win, against odds this severely stacked against you." Godric hesitated, clearly weighing his rapidly diminishing options, his fury warring visibly with the pragmatic recognition that his carefully laid plans had unraveled far more quickly and thoroughly than he had anticipated. Behind him, his own warriors exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing the same unfavorable odds their Alpha was struggling to accept. "This is not finished," Godric finally snarled, though the words carried more desperate defiance than genuine conviction. "You have humiliated my family not once, but twice now, and I will not simply forget such an insult." "Then let this be the moment it truly ends," Draven replied evenly. "I have no interest in prolonging this conflict, beyond what is necessary to secure Alara's safety and the security of my own territory. But if you continue to threaten either, I promise you, Godric, you will find me a considerably more formidable opponent than the grieving, guilt-ridden king you believed you could so easily manipulate into a losing confrontation." The standoff stretched taut for several long, tense moments, until finally Godric, recognizing the impossible odds now arrayed against him, gave a sharp, furious gesture to his remaining warriors, ordering their withdrawal back toward the stronghold. He cast one final, venomous glare toward Draven and Alara before following his retreating forces, the immediate threat of violence finally beginning to recede from the valley. Draven turned immediately back to Alara, who stood trembling slightly in the aftermath of the confrontation, though whether from cold, exhaustion, or the overwhelming emotion of the past several hours, he could not entirely determine. He pulled his own cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it carefully around her, his hands lingering gently against her arms, as though reassuring himself that she was truly, genuinely safe. "I am sorry," he said quietly, the words carrying 5 years of accumulated regret, compressed into that single, simple apology. "I am sorry it took a war to finally prove to you that I meant every word I said in that bakery. I am sorry you were ever placed in danger because of a choice I made, long before I understood its true cost." Alara looked up at him, exhaustion and relief, and a complicated tangle of emotions she had not yet fully processed, evident in her tear-streaked expression. "You came for me," she said quietly, her voice carrying something close to wonder. "After everything, after 5 years, you actually came." "I will always come for you," Draven said, his voice fierce, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Whatever it costs, whatever kingdom or crown or treaty stands between us, I will always choose you, Alara. I should have chosen you from the very beginning. I am done being the man who let fear convince him that duty and truth could never coexist." Around them, the coalition warriors began the careful process of standing down from their battle readiness, while scouts continued monitoring the stronghold walls for any sign of renewed aggression from Godric's forces. But for the two of them, standing together in the cold valley beneath a sky finally beginning to lighten toward dawn, the wider political consequences of the confrontation felt momentarily distant, overshadowed entirely by the simple, overwhelming relief of finally, truly finding their way back to each other. Neither of them yet knew how the wider war between their territories would ultimately resolve, or what price the kingdom itself might still be required to pay for the choices both of them had made, in pursuit of a bond neither had ever truly been able to deny. But as Draven gently guided Alara back toward the safety of the coalition camp, her hand held securely in his own for the first time in 5 long years, both of them allowed themselves, if only briefly, to simply feel grateful for having survived to see this moment arrive at all. The days following Alara's rescue passed in a tense, uneasy standoff between Draven's coalition forces and the remnants of Godric's army, still positioned behind the stronghold's fortified walls. Neither side moved to escalate the confrontation further, though the underlying tension remained thick enough that Draven's advisors continued urging caution, wary of any sudden shift that might reignite open conflict. Alara spent those days recovering within the relative safety of the coalition camp, tended by healers who confirmed, with considerable relief, that she had suffered no lasting physical harm during her captivity. Draven visited her tent frequently, though he remained careful to respect the boundaries she needed as she processed everything that had happened, understanding intuitively that trust, once broken as thoroughly as his had been, could not simply be restored through a single dramatic rescue, however genuine his devotion had proven itself to be. It was during one of these quiet visits, on the 4th evening after her rescue, that Alara finally raised the question that had been weighing on her mind since the chaos of the valley confrontation. "What happens now?" she asked, watching him carefully across the small distance separating them within her tent. "You still have a wife, Draven, a kingdom that expects you to maintain the political stability that marriage was meant to provide. I cannot simply exist alongside those obligations indefinitely." Draven had spent considerable time turning this exact question over in his own mind throughout the tense days of the standoff, and he answered now, with the clarity of a decision he had already firmly made. "Seraphine and I spoke honestly with each other before I left the capital," he said. "Our marriage was never a genuine bond, Alara, only a political arrangement neither of us ever pretended otherwise about. I intend to formally dissolve that marriage the moment I return to the capital, regardless of whatever political consequences follow." "And the kingdom," Alara pressed. "The treaty with Godric's territory has already collapsed entirely. Dissolving your marriage to Seraphine will only further damage whatever fragile relationship might still exist between your territories." "Perhaps," Draven acknowledged, "but I have spent 5 years watching my kingdom weaken and fracture, precisely because I built its foundation on a lie rather than truth. I will not repeat that same mistake indefinitely, hoping for a different outcome. If Godric wishes to remain hostile toward my kingdom, regardless of the marriage's status, then we will address that hostility directly, with the full strength of the coalition now standing beside us. But I will not sacrifice you again, Alara, not for any treaty, not for any peace built on a foundation as fundamentally dishonest as the one I constructed 5 years ago." Alara studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the fear and hesitation that had driven his choice in that coronation hall so many years before, but found instead only steady, unwavering resolve. "You have changed," she observed quietly. "The man who rejected me in that hall would never have spoken with such certainty." "That man was a frightened boy, wearing a crown too heavy for him to properly carry," Draven said. "5 years of watching everything I sacrificed you for crumble anyway taught me a lesson I should have understood from the very beginning. Duty built on denial of the truth is not strength, Alara. It is simply a slower, more painful form of failure." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alistair, whose grim expression immediately signaled news of some new development requiring Draven's urgent attention. "My king," he said, "a rider has arrived from the stronghold under a flag of parley. Godric requests another audience, though he has not specified his intentions." Draven exchanged a careful glance with Elara before rising to address this new development, uncertain whether Godric intended genuine negotiation or simply another attempt at manipulation. He rode out to meet the messenger at the designated neutral ground, Alistair and a small honor guard accompanying him as before, and found not Godric himself waiting at the meeting point, but Seraphine, dressed in traveling clothes rather than her usual formal court attire, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Seraphine," Draven said, genuine surprise evident in his voice, "I did not expect to find you here, rather than your father." "My father does not know I have come," she admitted, glancing briefly toward the stronghold walls behind her, as though verifying she had not been followed. "I slipped away during the confusion, following the failed pursuit of your servant girl. I needed to speak with you directly, Draven, without his interference shaping the conversation." "Speak then," Draven said carefully, uncertain what to expect from this unexpected visit. "My father intends to continue this conflict, regardless of any resolution you might propose regarding our marriage," Seraphine said bluntly. "His pride will not allow him to simply withdraw peacefully after suffering such a public humiliation. He is already planning a renewed assault on your coalition forces, believing that a smaller, more targeted strike might succeed where the larger confrontation failed." Draven's expression darkened considerably at this news. "You are warning me of your own father's planned attack." "I am warning you," Seraphine confirmed, "because I have spent 5 years watching my father use my own marriage and dignity as tools in his relentless pursuit of expanded power and territory, and I am finished serving as an instrument in his ambitions. I do not love you, Draven, and I know you have never loved me. But I respect honesty, even when it arrives inconveniently late, and I would rather see this conflict end through genuine resolution than continue serving as justification for my father's endless warmongering." "What do you propose?" Draven asked, genuinely curious despite the tension of the moment. "Formally dissolve our marriage, as you clearly intend to do regardless of my input," Seraphine said, "but do so publicly, in a manner that clearly places responsibility for the treaty's collapse on my father's aggressive actions, rather than your personal choices. Make clear to every allied territory watching this conflict that my father orchestrated a kidnapping and planned an unprovoked assault, purely to satisfy his own ambitions. Strip him of whatever moral justification he believes he currently holds, and I suspect you will find considerably less appetite among his own warriors for continuing a war built on such thoroughly indefensible foundations." Draven studied her carefully, recognizing in her calculated proposal both genuine wisdom and a certain personal vindication. She clearly saw it against a father who had spent years treating her as merely a useful piece in his own political ambitions. "You would betray your own father's plans to me." "I would end a war that serves no purpose beyond satisfying his wounded pride," Seraphine corrected firmly. "And I would finally claim some measure of agency over my own life, rather than continuing to exist as a tool wielded by the men around me, whether that man is my father or the husband who never truly wanted me in the first place." Draven nodded slowly, genuine respect for her courage evident in his expression. "Thank you, Seraphine, for this warning, and for the honesty you have shown throughout this entire difficult situation, despite everything I failed to offer you in return." "Do not thank me yet," she said, already turning to head back toward the stronghold before her absence could be discovered. "Prepare your coalition forces, Draven. My father's attack will come within the next 2 days, and he intends to strike during the night, when he believes your forces will be least prepared to respond effectively." She disappeared back toward the stronghold walls, leaving Draven standing alone with Alistair, the weight of this new intelligence settling heavily over both of them. "We must prepare immediately," Draven said grimly. "Alert the coalition commanders. Whatever Godric intends to unleash, we will meet it fully prepared, and we will ensure that every allied territory watching this conflict understands with absolute clarity exactly who bears responsibility for the violence about to unfold." He returned to the coalition camp with renewed urgency, the fragile peace of the previous days giving way once again to the immediate necessity of preparing for the confrontation Seraphine's warning had made clear was rapidly approaching. Alara, informed of the situation upon his return, insisted on remaining within the camp despite the danger, refusing to be sent away to safety, while the conflict that had already cost her so much continued unfolding around her. "I have spent 5 years running from difficult truths," she told Draven firmly, when he suggested she might be safer relocated further from the impending confrontation. "I will not run again now, not when the outcome of this conflict will determine so much about both of our futures. Whatever comes next, I intend to face it alongside you, not hidden away somewhere distant and safe, while others fight the battles that concern my own life just as much as yours." Draven did not argue further, recognizing in her firm resolve an echo of his own hard-won determination, never again to sacrifice honesty and genuine connection for the sake of convenient safety. Together, they prepared alongside the coalition forces for whatever violence Godric's planned assault might bring, both of them fully aware that the coming confrontation would likely determine, once and for all, whether the bond they had fought so hard to reclaim could finally exist without the constant shadow of political conflict looming over its future. Godric's assault came exactly as Seraphine had warned, striking under the cover of deep darkness on the second night following her secret warning. But Draven's coalition forces, fully prepared thanks to the advance intelligence, met the attack with a readiness that caught Godric's warriors completely off guard, their carefully planned surprise strike collapsing almost immediately into confused, desperate retreat. Draven fought at the front of his coalition forces throughout the brief, intense confrontation, his wolf form moving through the chaotic darkness with a controlled, purposeful power that left little doubt among the assembled warriors, from every allied territory present, that their king possessed strength worthy of the crown he carried. He fought not with reckless fury, but with the focused determination of a man defending everything he had finally allowed himself to genuinely value, refusing to let either his kingdom or the woman he loved fall to the ambitions of a man who valued conquest over genuine peace. The confrontation ended within an hour, Godric's forces retreating in disarray back toward the stronghold, having suffered losses considerably heavier than the coalition forces they had failed to surprise. Draven pursued the retreat only far enough to ensure the immediate threat had genuinely passed, resisting the temptation to press the advantage further into an assault on the stronghold itself, understanding that further escalation would only compound the tragedy of a conflict he genuinely wished to see resolved, rather than endlessly prolonged. In the aftermath of the failed assault, word spread rapidly among the allied territories watching the conflict, exactly as Seraphine had predicted. News of Godric's unprovoked night attack, following his earlier kidnapping of an innocent woman, thoroughly undermined whatever sympathy his cause might once have commanded among neutral observers. Within days, several territories that had previously maintained cautious neutrality formally condemned Godric's actions, while even some of his own longtime allies began quietly withdrawing their support, unwilling to be associated with such blatantly aggressive and morally indefensible conduct. Godric himself, facing mounting pressure from his own council and dwindling support among his warriors following the failed assault, found himself increasingly isolated within his own stronghold. Reports reached Draven's camp within the week, indicating growing unrest among Godric's own people, many of whom had never fully supported their alpha's aggressive ambitions, and had grown weary of a conflict that seemed increasingly likely to bring only continued suffering, rather than the territorial gains Godric had originally promised. It was Seraphine, ultimately, who brought the conflict to its final resolution. Having witnessed her father's authority crumble further with each passing day following the failed assault, she confronted him directly within the stronghold's council chambers, joined by several of his own advisors, who had similarly grown disillusioned with his relentless pursuit of a war that offered increasingly little chance of success. "This conflict ends now, Father," Seraphine declared before the assembled council, her voice carrying a newfound authority that surprised even those who had known her throughout her entire life. "You have lost the support of your allies, the confidence of your own council, and the moral justification you once believed you held. Continuing this war serves no purpose beyond satisfying your wounded pride, and I will not watch our people suffer further for the sake of that pride." Godric, weakened by the mounting pressure surrounding him, found himself with dwindling options to resist his daughter's public challenge to his authority. The council, sensing the shifting tide of support, moved swiftly to formalize terms for a negotiated peace, terms that Godric, isolated and increasingly desperate, ultimately had little genuine choice but to accept. The formal negotiations that followed took place over several tense days, conducted between representatives of Draven's coalition and Godric's remaining council, with Seraphine herself playing a central role in brokering terms that both sides could accept. The final agreement dissolved the original marriage treaty between Draven and Seraphine without assigning blame to either party individually, instead formally documenting Godric's unprovoked aggression as the true catalyst for the conflict's escalation. Godric retained his position as alpha of his territory, though stripped of much of the expanded authority he had accumulated over the preceding years, with Seraphine assuming a formal role within her father's council to ensure more moderate leadership moving forward. Draven, for his part, agreed to maintain peaceful relations with Godric's territory moving forward, provided no further aggression emerged from that direction, while formally severing any political obligation tied to his previous marriage. The coalition forces that had gathered in his support during the crisis remained as informal allies, strengthened rather than weakened by their shared experience confronting Godric's aggression together. When the formal negotiations finally concluded, Draven found Elara waiting for him at the edge of the coalition camp, watching the distant stronghold walls with an expression of careful, cautious relief. "It is finished," he told her, settling beside her, as the last light of evening painted the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. "Godric has been stripped of his ambitions. Seraphine has claimed genuine authority within her own territory, and the marriage that once stood between us has been formally dissolved, without cost to either kingdom's stability." Elara turned to look at him, searching his expression for confirmation of what this resolution truly meant for both of their futures. "Then what happens now, Draven? For us, specifically, beyond the resolution of this war?" Draven took her hands in his own, his expression carrying the same fierce, unwavering resolve he had shown throughout the entire crisis. "Now, I intend to do what I should have done 5 years ago, the moment I first felt this bond between us in that coronation hall. I intend to claim you, publicly and completely, before my entire kingdom, without hesitation, without political calculation, without any consideration beyond the simple, undeniable truth of what you mean to me." "Your kingdom may not easily accept a servant girl as their queen," Elara said, though her voice carried more hope than genuine doubt now. "Even with the treaty dissolved, even with Godric's aggression exposed, there will still be those among your council who question such a choice." "Then they will simply have to accept it," Draven said firmly, "because I am finished making choices based on what my council finds politically convenient, rather than what I know, in my heart and in my bond, to be genuinely true. I spent 5 years believing that duty required me to deny you. I have learned, through considerable pain and hard-won experience, that true duty to my kingdom requires honesty above all else, even when that honesty proves inconvenient to those who prefer comfortable lies." Elara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they carried none of the devastating grief that had accompanied her tears 5 years earlier, in that coronation hall. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly. "Frightened of returning to that world, of facing a court that once watched me humiliated so completely. But I am more frightened, I think, of continuing to run from a bond that has never once released its hold on either of us, regardless of how far or how long I tried to escape it." "You will not face that world alone," Draven promised. "Whatever challenges await us at the capital, whatever resistance we encounter from those unwilling to accept this choice, we will face it together, exactly as we should have from the very beginning." They remained together at the edge of the coalition camp as evening deepened into full night, the immediate crisis finally resolved, though both of them understood that considerable challenges likely still awaited them upon their return to the capital. But for the first time since that devastating coronation day 5 years earlier, neither Draven nor Elara faced those challenges, burdened by the same fear and uncertainty that had once driven them apart. They faced them instead as true partners, bound together by a connection that had survived rejection, distance, war, and every obstacle that circumstance and duty had placed between them, finally free to build the future that fate had always intended for them both. The journey back to the capital took considerably longer than the desperate ride that had originally carried Draven toward Millbrook, this time accompanied not by a single trusted tracker, but by the full assembly of coalition forces, along with Elara riding steadily at Draven's side, her presence no longer something to be hidden or denied, but openly acknowledged before every warrior and ally who had witnessed the resolution of the crisis firsthand. Word of their approach reached the capital well before their actual arrival, carried by messengers eager to report both the successful resolution of the border conflict and the unmistakable, publicly acknowledged presence of the woman who had once been so thoroughly humiliated within the very palace she now approached. The court buzzed with anticipation, and no small amount of anxious speculation, uncertain exactly what reception awaited their returning king, and the woman whose rejection had shaped the entire trajectory of his troubled reign. Draven called for a full assembly of the court the morning after their return, refusing to delay the reckoning he knew was necessary, before he could properly begin the future he intended to build. He stood once again upon the same dais where he had delivered his devastating rejection 5 years earlier, though this time Elara stood openly beside him, her chin lifted with a quiet dignity that bore little resemblance to the frightened servant girl who had once dropped a wine tray in stunned, devastated silence within this very hall. 5 years ago, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent, attentive hall. I stood in this exact place and made the greatest mistake of my life. I denied a bond that every wolf in this kingdom understands to be sacred, choosing instead a political convenience that I believed, at the time, would protect this kingdom from unnecessary conflict. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, though Draven continued without pause, determined to speak the full truth before this court, exactly as he had promised Elara he would. That choice did not protect this kingdom. It weakened it, steadily, over 5 long years, exactly as our oldest traditions warned it would. It cost us stability, prosperity, and ultimately nearly cost us peace entirely, when the very alliance I sacrificed everything to protect collapsed regardless, due to ambitions that honest dealing could never have satisfied in the first place. He turned to look directly at Elara, his expression softening considerably, even as his voice remained steady and clear. I stand before you today to correct that mistake, fully and without reservation. This woman, Elara, is my true and fated mate, recognized by my bond the very first moment I encountered her within these walls. I claim her now, publicly and completely, as my rightful queen, and I ask this court to recognize what should have been recognized 5 years ago, had fear and political calculation not clouded my judgment so completely. The hall remained silent for a long, suspended moment, the weight of the king's public declaration settling over the assembled court. Then, slowly, Nathaniel, the very elder who had once so pointedly criticized Draven's rejected bond as a source of the kingdom's weakness, stepped forward from among the assembled council members. "My king," he said, his weathered voice carrying surprising warmth, "I have spent 5 years watching this kingdom struggle beneath the weight of a choice I always believed was fundamentally mistaken. I confess I did not expect to see it corrected in quite so dramatic a fashion, but I welcome this reversal with genuine relief. Our traditions have always taught that a true bond, once properly honored, restores strength to both the Alpha and the territory he protects. I, for one, look forward to witnessing that restoration unfold." Other council members and nobles gradually voiced similar sentiments, some more enthusiastically than others, though the overall reception carried far more relief and acceptance than either Draven or Elara had genuinely dared to hope for beforehand. Not every voice in the hall carried unqualified support, certainly, and Elara noticed a handful of nobles whose expressions remained carefully guarded, unwilling to fully commit their approval to such an unprecedented reversal. But the overall tide of the assembled court's reaction left little doubt that Draven's public declaration had been, on the whole, genuinely well received. In the weeks that followed, Elara gradually adjusted to the considerable transformation her life continued to undergo, moving from the quiet, hidden existence she had built in Millbrook toward the far more visible and demanding role that awaited her as the Alpha King's openly acknowledged mate. She insisted on maintaining certain elements of the life and identity she had built during her 5 years of exile, refusing to let the trappings of royal life erase the genuine growth and independence she had achieved during that difficult but formative period. She also insisted, once matters had settled sufficiently within the capital, on sending word to Millbrook, both to check on Mira's well-being following the chaos of her capture, and, more difficult still, to properly address the situation with Callum, whose gentle kindness had carried her through years of loneliness she could never fully repay, even as she now understood with complete certainty that her heart had always ultimately belonged elsewhere. She wrote him a careful, honest letter, explaining everything that had transpired, and offering her genuine gratitude for the steadiness and comfort he had provided during a period of her life when she desperately needed exactly that. Callum's response, when it eventually arrived, carried a graciousness that spoke well of his character, wishing her genuine happiness, even as he acknowledged, with quiet dignity, that some bonds simply could not be replicated by even the most sincere and patient devotion. Draven, meanwhile, dedicated himself to rebuilding the kingdom's stability with a renewed energy and clarity of purpose that even his most skeptical advisors found difficult to deny. Freed from the constant undercurrent of guilt and denial that had shadowed his previous years of rule, he approached his responsibilities with a steadiness and confidence that gradually restored genuine faith among both his council and the wider population, who had grown accustomed to whispered rumors about their king's weakened, cursed bond, finally giving way to visible, tangible evidence of restored strength and prosperity throughout the territory. The formal coronation ceremony, when it finally took place several months later, bore little resemblance to the political spectacle that had originally brought Draven and Elara together 5 years earlier under such devastating circumstances. This time, the hall filled not with careful political calculation and rigid diplomatic protocol, but with genuine celebration, as Draven formally presented Elara before the full assembled court, not as a political convenience or strategic alliance, but as the true and rightful partner his own wolf had recognized from the very first moment of their meeting. Elara stood before that same crowd, in that same grand hall, wearing robes befitting her new station, her chin lifted with a confidence and dignity that bore no trace of the devastated servant girl who had once fled these walls in shattered humiliation. When Draven finally spoke the formal words claiming her, completely and publicly, as his true mate and queen, the mark that had once burned so painfully at her throat, the permanent reminder of his earlier rejection, finally dissolved entirely, replaced by the warm, steady glow of a bond, fully accepted and honored at last. The kingdom that emerged from this transformation was not without its continuing challenges, certainly. Political complexities, lingering skepticism among certain factions, and the practical difficulties of Elara's transition into royal life all remained genuine obstacles that would require considerable patience and effort to fully navigate. But the fundamental foundation upon which that kingdom now rested had shifted decisively, moving from a fragile stability, built on denial and political convenience, towards something considerably more durable, a genuine partnership between an alpha king and his true mate, bound together not by treaty or obligation, but by the simple, undeniable truth that had waited patiently for 5 long years to finally be honored. As the celebration continued late into that evening, Draven found a quiet moment to stand alone with Elara on the same palace balcony where he had once spent so many restless nights grieving a choice he believed could never be undone. He wrapped his arms around her, watching the stars scatter across the clear night sky above the kingdom they now shared completely, and felt, for the first time and longer than he could clearly remember, a genuine and complete peace settle over him. 5 years, Elara said softly, leaning back against him, watching the same stars with an expression of quiet contentment. 5 years of running, of hiding, of believing this moment could never truly arrive. 5 years I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for, Draven replied, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. Whatever challenges still await us, Elara, we face them now exactly as we should have from the very beginning, together, honestly, and without any fear left standing between us. Below them, the kingdom stretched out beneath the starlit sky, no longer a fragile piece built on sacrifice and denial, but a foundation finally strong enough to weather whatever future challenges still awaited, built upon the simple, powerful truth that some bonds, however delayed or however difficult the path toward honoring them might prove to be, were always worth the fight required to finally claim them completely.